This is the Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, featuring Nicholas Gvosdev, Tatiana Serafin, Stephen Adler, and Carlos Martínez de la Serna. This episode was recorded on June 3rd, 2021.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow at Carnegie Council. Very excited today to talk about global press freedom, an issue very close to my heart as a former Forbes reporter and as someone who launched First Amendment Watch. Free speech, press freedom is so important. We have two super advocates for press freedom here with us today. Stephen J. Adler is currently the board chair of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and Columbia Journalism Review. Also former editor-in-chief of Reuters News. So firsthand experience of what reporters are experiencing on the ground. Similarly, Carlos Martínez de la Serna joins us from the Committee to Protect Journalists, where he is a program director looking and leading at a team of researchers investigating attacks on journalists globally, former journalist also. So you can also give us your perspective on what's happening on the ground around the world. And I think this issue is really important to our audience. We try to connect international news with our audience and to make it real and why is this important today? And I really liked what CPJ said in a statement where you were giving advice to what the Biden-Harris administration should do. And you led with the defense of press freedom has been a cornerstone of US foreign policy since World War II. I don't know how many people in our audience recognize this fact, or maybe they recognize it, but it's disappeared a little bit. In the realm of press freedom, the US is the indispensable nation. Wow, that is a very strong statement. And so I ask Carlos, Steve, are we indispensable in press freedom?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. The U.S. has an outsized role in press freedom around the world, and we really saw that during the Trump administration, sort of in both the absence of that and the actual negativity. I think the U.S. has made it a part of foreign policy somewhat inconsistently, but ambassadors and even presidents and cabinet members have definitely been out there in the world trying to put a damper on restrictions on press freedom and make it an issue, and sometimes a public issue when dealing with other governments. So we saw the contrast during the Trump administration, where the president called the media the enemy of the people, started to popularize the concept of fake news, and we see several dozen countries actually passing laws against fake news using those words in the aftermath of that. So I think the US went from a very significant positive force to a pretty significant negative force that empowered or enabled authoritarian countries around the world to restrict press freedom, knowing that the US would not stand in the way and perhaps would even encourage it. So that's been an enormous issue, and what waits to be seen now, and what we're very interested in, all of us, is what will happen with the Biden administration. How much credibility does the US have left in this sphere, and how much of that credibility is the Biden administration going to try to leverage in favor of press freedom issues?
Carlos, has the US lost credibility? What do you think?
I think so. It's I think it's hard not to look back at Trump's administration record and think about the negative impact it had in many aspects regarding this press freedom. We can look inside within the US, and we can definitely look at the impact outside. I don't think we would be seeing some of the things we're seeing today. For example, the current situation in countries like El Salvador, for example, or in Brazil, or in other places around the world, if not for the 4 years of the Trump administration that completely disregarded the role of the press and the role of the US administration in defending that role, right, in advocating for the free press. So it's not that the foreign policy of the US being exempt of contradictions throughout history. That's the case for the US and for any other country. But it's been always there. It's that defending press freedom abroad, at least, and also internally, but was something consistent with its values, its principles, its ideals of what it wanted to achieve, right? And that was completely absent during Trump administration. And the problem is, through those 4 years, other countries were like leaning towards the opposite, in the sense of attacking the press in a way that it was like planting the seeds for some of the things we're seeing right now.
And I think the connection that Carlos makes between what's happening in the US and what's happening abroad is really important, because it's not just a question of policy or of how the US talks about press freedom when it's working around the world, but it's also a question of example. And I think when in the US, we see so much difficulties the press is having in all sorts of realms. Members of the press being physically attacked and abused by police during many of the street protests. We see the seizure of phone records by the Trump administration, which is a big issue right now that we're hoping the Biden Justice Department takes a strong stand on. You see the trolling that goes on online, and some of it extraordinarily vicious, that has certainly been encouraged and participated in by people who had been in the government. And so that example creates a toxicity around the media that not only is really dangerous in the US, but also has these ramifications and the spillover effect when you look at it globally.
And maybe to add to what Stephen was saying, I think it might be interesting for the audience to realize that foreign policy is a concept. It's later implemented through very specific things like consulates, embassies, ambassadors. Those are specific things. Those are frontline defenders, actually. And that's been historically the case, regardless of the administration. When journalists have problems in any country, they trust that they could go to the US embassy, they could rely on the support of the embassy, the consulate. The embassies were attended trials, helped many times, not publicly, but they were like a front line. So we went from like that practice to an administration that not only disregarded that in the public statements, but that stopped supporting that type of thing that is essential, right? So the US influence goes from the importance of setting the tone and setting the principles very clear to that very basic, important defense that many journalists around the world are relying on.
I think that's super important. Both of you are talking about tone, example, leadership. This lack of leadership, and we're a few months in. I mean, what changes are you seeing? Are you seeing any? Are you not seeing any changes? I mean, where are we in the balance here? And is the last 4 years or that change, did that lead to what happened? And this is one of the things I wanted to talk about today, Nick and I, in Belarus, with the Ryanair flight being taken down. The idea, if for those of us in our audience who may not know, that there was a bomb threat against this particular flight, but once the flight landed in Belarus, the authorities went on and arrested blogger and independent journalist Roman Protasevich and his girlfriend, and they are currently in jail in Belarus and giving what some say are forced confessions. We don't know much more than that. It's difficult to get information. But did these last 4 years empower what happened, and can we turn the tide?
I'll take that for a moment. Turn it over to Carlos. I'm not sure that the U.S. would have been able to stop that, or that the environment would have changed. I think the issues in places like Belarus and Russia have been extremely difficult, and would be for any president. And I think it's also probably not a good idea to attribute any specific action to either an absence of involvement by the U.S. or negative involvement. That was a bizarre situation. I mean, here was somebody who wasn't even traveling to or from Belarus, and I don't think we've ever seen anything like that. And it's very, very scary. But I do think it goes specifically to issues of authoritarianism in that region. I think as far as the Biden administration right now, the Committee to Protect Journalists has sought the appointment of a press freedom envoy or emissary, which I personally think is a good idea. And I think as far as we can tell, people are in the administration who we've met with or talked to have sort of a positive approach towards this and see it positively. So I think the issue is going to be more a question of priorities. This is an administration that's working on a more than $1 trillion both rescue and infrastructure plan. We're in a very polarized country. There's limited bandwidth. So I think the question we're all waiting to get answered, is this going to be a high enough priority? Is it going to be recognized as something that's critical, or is it going to fall a little bit by the wayside? And I think one early test of that is how the Justice Department responds and how actively it responds to the three separate reports of seizures of phone records by the Trump department, to the Trump administration Justice Department. And we haven't, although President Biden came out strongly against those kinds of seizures, what we in the kind of press freedom world would like to see is a real accounting for what were the rationales given at the time, how did this get approved, what was the thinking around why this was appropriate, and how do we make sure that that approach doesn't go forward? And so we're still waiting to see that, and that hasn't happened yet. And that would be a good indication that there was a high level of interest in this.
I would totally agree with Stephen. I think it's very difficult, and I think that's it kind of removes the complexities of the situation that we try to blame specific cases on. So as important as was the Trump administration in setting the tone and agenda, and mostly I would say in creating an environment which is it's way more difficult to defend press freedom. The situation in Belarus precedes that. It's always had a terrible press freedom record. It is involved in Russia. It's a situation around the contested elections in August 2020 aggravated everything. And then speaks about the global press freedom situation, the deterioration in many countries. In countries where there's a democracy, in countries where there's no democracy, but journalists still resist and keep reporting. I think what we want to see from the Biden administration is taking this as serious as it is, in the sense that we need them to speak out publicly, quickly, on these type of violations. We need them to take press freedom as a foundational principle and not a transactional principle. You can maybe bring it out in some contexts, but not in others. And that will, again, help all of us, and starting with the journalists, create a better safety environment for them, which in some cases is extremely complex and is not going to be solved just by one administration. So the situation in Belarus is extremely difficult, but I think it's always important to remind that there's things you can do. There's always things we all can do, and there are specific things, right? We can keep the pressure on that this is something that's non-negotiable, press freedom. We can, of course, express solidarity in many forms, support directly family and relatives and colleagues in the country. We need to ask foreign embassies to attend trials. So that's kind of something that doesn't seem like a big lift, but it's important to know that for journalists to know the foreign embassies are going to be there monitoring trials. The legal aspects of defending press freedom, and Stephen can talk about the Reporters Committee exceptional work on that, is very important. So we need to work together with all those like legal support to actually defend journalists when their rights are being threatened or their physically being attacked, right? So there are many things that can happen at the basic level, from the embassies to institutions and international organizations. That's what we expect from Biden administration, to help articulate and support that agenda.
Yeah. I think another thing to note is that this is a much wider phenomenon than just a few countries we've talked about. And it's also disturbing that countries that have been part of a democratic evolution or been described as being part of a democratic evolution are going significantly backwards in this area. You think of Ethiopia, which had started to open up in terms of press freedom, and now is a really, really dangerous place. One of our journalists from Reuters, Kumera Demetriou, was arrested for no known reason and held for 12 days, and a number of other journalists there have been arrested. Myanmar, where we had 2 journalists who were in prison for 511 days on false charges. That Myanmar has become a disaster for journalism, and it was actually a place where independent local journalism was flowering. So there were issues under Aung San Suu Kyi, but it's clearly gotten worse in the current situation. And you also look at India, which has become a difficult place for independent journalism to occur. You look at Turkey, Hong Kong with its new national security laws, an incredibly difficult and dangerous place to do journalism. Russia has always been problematic. So these are issues going on all over the world. And I do think they're part of a trend that just isn't just about Donald Trump or the U.S. I think there are a lot of things. Carlos, I'm sure, has his own views. To me, one of the things I saw from my 10 years in the Reuters role was that as social media grew, the ability of countries and terrorist organizations as well to reach their intended audience directly and not go through the media empowered them to basically take the position that you have to be for us or against us. If you're against us, we're going to persecute you or imprison you, maybe kill you. And if you're for us, you essentially become part of our propaganda mechanism. And you see that going on all over the world. And the effectiveness in Myanmar, until Facebook cut them out, the military and the government primarily communicated through Facebook, and Facebook allowed that for a very long period of time. So we have to look at all of those things, how the social media companies empower authoritarian regimes, and we have to be thinking, it's a very complicated issue, but we have to be thinking in a sophisticated way about that. We also have to be thinking about the unpopularity of the media around the world, which is a phenomenon that has kind of multiple factors, but you may be familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, which measures trust of various institutions. And the one in 2021 showed that 59% of people they surveyed globally believed that the press intentionally said false things and intentionally were trying to mislead people and cared much more about their political ideology than about facts and the truth. So we do need to find a way to get back to a place where people care about facts. They recognize what good journalism is. I think media literacy education is incredibly important so people can distinguish between misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and news. So we have a lot of work to do ourselves on trying to find a way to rebuild trust in media so that there's a stronger argument to make for free press.
It's almost as if you were reading my mind in the comments you just raised, because I had just jotted down some points here. And one of them was, we've seen this trend over the last 10, 15 years, bipartisan in the United States, certainly, and in other democracies as well as non-democracies, of invoking national security considerations against reporting. You talked a bit about the impact of social media, and also the idea that that people on social media increasingly may be primed to say, why do I need to wait the reporting done by a reporter because I just read an interesting Facebook post that someone forwarded to me, and they're basically about equal. The loss of trust, I think, is also an important question. And so that brings me back to something about the Roman Protasevich case that I would like to raise with you, which is how he's being described. That we've seen in how he is described, it goes back and forth between him as a reporter, as a media figure, as a chronicler of events, versus him described as an activist, opposition figure. And that to me suggests, and to get your opinion on this, is that a risky blurring of roles? That is to say, I'm a member of the press, but I'm also an activist, or I'm seeking political outcomes. And you raised this about the barometer survey on this. Do we need to go back, or is part of media literacy to media organizations about what they're, do we need to kind of redefine what it is to be a reporter, a figure in the media, in terms of understanding, well, is this because, if you are, are you a reporter? Are you an activist? Are you chronicling events, or are you trying to shape them? Or is that just really a distinction without a difference? So I'd be interested in your take. And then also, for when do you've talked a bit about governments intervening. At what point, does a government say, we don't think you're a member of the media? We saw this with the Jamal Khashoggi case, that there were some who kind of backed away. Well, he's a columnist, but is he really the media, a reporter, or is he something else? And I think that was the wiggle room that allowed certainly the U.S. government to perhaps sidestep the question of his murder as a attack on press freedom. So sorry for the long-winded setup there, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, maybe Carlos can start in on this, because I know CPJ has to grapple with this issue all the time.
Sure.
So I'd love to hear his take, but I'll also come in after.
Sure, thank you. So I think for us, it's very important not to focus on the definition of journalism, but to define the context for around the person that's not being able to do certain job. So when we go about any case in the world, when there's any press freedom, potential press freedom violation, what we try to understand is the context. So I think we need to start from situation where the professionalism of the idea of a professional journalist is very different around the world, and depending on the context, in some places is completely kind of very difficult, if not impossible, to be an independent professional journalist. To be a you can be a professional journalist, but kind of within structures that are not necessarily independent. Yeah. So, because one of the best strategies to attack press freedom is to outlaw journalism, right? To make journalism as such, like out of law. So then we're going to be seeing a lot of people working on the edges, doing journalism, committing acts of journalism that might not be as such if we look at very like academic or standard definition, but that doesn't reflect the realities of the job and the reporting and the incident. So Roman Prasasevich was definitely doing journalism, is definitely journalist. I don't care about how you like what anything else you might add to his work, right? But I think it's important that's part of the misinformation campaign. It's part of the strategy to outlaw journalism, to kind of foster this endless conversation about, is this journalism, is that journalism, was Khashoggi a journalist or not? I think it's irrelevant to the extent that they were committing acts of journalism. They required certain freedom that breathed in space in the context of First Amendment, and that it wasn't there. And so that's what we are denouncing, that this person cannot do this. This is an act of journalism. This is not a crime, basically. And I think for us, we try to be very fact-based about the context, the situation, and the overall context for the country. So we try to bypass that conversation and focus on the important thing, which is journalism in any other forms it might take is not a crime.
And I completely agree with what Carlos said about that. So just to take sort of the second question, which is I think a slightly different question, which is, would the media be trusted more if particularly the big Western media, and again, what journalism is very different in different countries, and the context is different, and the ability to be so-called neutral, may not exist in many countries. But if you're looking at the US and you're looking at the West, there's a very, very active debate going on around whether there is still something valid about the old principles that we would have called objective journalism, or whether that's sort of a smokescreen for a ruling class perspective on the world. And the way I would come at that question, at least from a Western perspective, is I do think of journalism as a craft. And if you think of various crafts, ranging from, I guess I have dentistry in my mind because I've just done some, ranging from dentistry to an accountant to, many people who perform very specific skilled services. We don't generally pay a lot of attention to what their political views are, nor do we especially care, nor should we especially care. So there's an aspect of journalism that I think is craft. We are trained and skilled in gathering information, in getting beneath the surface and finding out things that other people don't want us to know, in doing forensics, in doing data journalism, where fundamentally we're trying to find out a set of facts that are elusive and difficult to find. And if we're good at it and we practice our craft well, then we'll come up with a set of facts. And to me, that shouldn't be about what your political position is or kind of what your own personal truth is, but rather, as a fact finder, as somebody who's just good at that because it's their skill. And then to try to distribute that honestly as well as you can, so that people can take that information and say, okay, the earth is warming at a certain rate, or there's flooding going on here, and maybe there's social action that needs to occur, but to let that user or that reader kind of come to that conclusion based on the reporter who's helping you figure out, for example, is Exxon actually following so-called ESG provisions or not, or all the things that we're reading about now. So I believe that it's a craft, and at a high level, it's a very, very advanced craft, and that if practiced that way, in many instances, but one's perspective or personal opinion really isn't the issue. The issue is your ability to gather the facts and to produce them honestly. And I do think much of the public is craving that. And I think there's a lot of survey information and a lot of anecdotal information that people would prefer that to the wildly polarized media that we're facing right now. So I think that would help if there was more of that. Yeah.
Earlier, you mentioned sometimes the lack of trust in journalists, right? Like from the public. And I think that's a critical thing, definitely. And we're seeing that as a source also of very serious problems and attacks and overall undermining journalism as well. And just to be specific, like a few days ago, I was listening to a journalist from El Salvador who's going through a hugely, steep deterioration of the situation in the country in the last 2 years, aggravated in the last weeks only. And he was telling me that, a few things, but one is that El Salvador hasn't had a full opportunity to be a full democracy, right? It only has 2 decades of a democracy. And as the democracy was developing and getting to some potential, became an administration that it's only communicated through social media, and then through official communication report statements, but made social media the main way of campaigning and getting in touch and being engaging with the constituency. And journalists became definitely, for many people in Salvador, part of the problem. So this is a huge issue, right? When we're trying to defend them, basically, and defend their rights to do their jobs. And there are many things we can think of, right, about how to tackle this problem. But maybe going back to the beginning of the conversation about the responsibilities of the administrations that might be relevant to the audiences. Well, let's start by referring to journalism, let's start by criticizing them with some civic tone, right? With some responsibility. Let's start by from there. We don't talk about other institutions or people trying to improve at the end civic life in as many ways by denigrating them, by demonizing them, right? That's happening for journalists. So there are many, we could call structural problems we could try to tackle, but we can start by adopting a tone when referring about media that is not about demonizing, which has another goal, which is not pointing to the media, but undermining journalism, right? Well, undermining its main like goal, which is uncover corruption, to uncover real political problems. And so there's a clear political intention there. And I think we all need to be aware of that and try to engage with each other about any problems we might see. They're perfectly fine about criticizing them, but with a civic tone and with looking into how we make better things instead of turning them down, right?
I wish that would happen. That's my wish. But Steve, you had tweeted this article from CGR on from the existential issue on Philip DeFranco and the power of news influencers. And I'm bringing this up because Nick, you mentioned what is there a definition? Steve, this is a craft, this is a skill, it's a profession. And yet here you come in with social media, and we just talked about some of the problems with social media. And one of them is that anybody can say anything and tell you that it's the news. And on YouTube, there's so many examples of people having their own show where they regurgitate the news, and that's what people are watching. One of the reasons we put our stuff on YouTube too, right? People watch YouTube. And so this is where I think that the confusion comes from reaching our goal of creating a more civil tone, creating trust and transparency, when you have this hybrid form emerging of news influencer, and what is that, and what is the impact of that, and how do we harness the positive energy of that, which is people are watching news.
Yeah,
that's fabulous. How do we harness that energy and yet put some sort of structure and professionalism on it? Can we do that internally? Can we then export that globally? Any ideas from your respective organizations?
Well, I'm a big First Amendment advocate, and so I'd be really loath to start putting standards and restrictions. I think at least theoretically, the marketplace of ideas, letting a lot of things out there has really sustained us, as a society. So. One can't be backward looking. You have to look at and embrace things that are coming. That YouTube influencer channel you're talking about, I think has a larger audience than the evening news shows, and that's just something that's happening. So I'd go back to a couple of things. I often thought of what we did at Reuters as, in some sense, creating the raw material that everybody else is going to use in different ways, because essentially Reuters, is a news agency that has thousands of customers who are other news organizations, including really small ones, and including YouTube news influencers. So if we and AP and people like us can do our jobs right, then at least there's a factual basis from which people can be riffing and handling it all sorts of different ways. So I think that's one point. And then the other thing that I really want to come back to in detail, or at least with more emphasis, is I've come to the conclusion that there's not a whole lot the media can do to limit misinformation and disinformation, because misinformation and disinformation is kind of going out there in the billions and trillions of pieces of information. And the most that a news organization can control or even fact check is kind of more in the thousands. So most stuff is going to go out there unmediated. So the question is, who does it go out to, and how well prepared are those people to understand what they're getting, propaganda is, to understand what facts are, to understand whether it's coming from a real organization or it's a fake organization. So to me, there's nothing more important we can be teaching in our schools, and I would say that globally, given the world we're now living in, the education system is just archaic in terms of saying, what are the skills? Well, to me, given how many hours people spend consuming media every day, among the most important skills is the ability to understand what they're getting, what it means, where it's coming from, what a source is, and being able to sort what they're more comfortable feeling is legitimate and what isn't. And I think that's kind of the next frontier in being able to kind of build the kind of information society that we really want to build. So much more emphasis needs to be placed on that, kind of the receiving end rather than the delivering end.
Yes, if I totally aligned with Stephen. So I'm not a fan at all of trying to regulate the communication channels in any way, right? I always mention, already did, the breathing space required for First Amendment to thrive, and that includes many ways, many forms of speech, and I might disagree, but it's part of a healthy environment, right? So, and I will also alert on the dangers of trying to regulate them, because we might see them as legit in some context, but we definitely have seen in others being used to stifle journalism at the end. So what you do here, this has been also mentioned several times already in this conversation, when we talk about press freedom, this is a global context. So we cannot think of just one thing. Everything's connected. We need to be nuanced and also cautious in how to assign responsibilities in some specifics. And also when it's about regulating and things like that, what can be used here with some maybe potential benefits definitely will be used in other contexts to stifle and attack journalists. We've seen that with internet regulations, internet disruptions, internet content takedowns, things like that, right? So that's already happening. It's already a problem. I would say that I think what media organizations, professional media organizations, are trying to do, and is very useful, is many are engaging in trying to make more transparent the process, so people understand what is behind that journalist piece, right? And I think that's very useful. It's complex and it also involves many things, including source protection and journalist protection as well. But it's useful, and there's some initiatives there, like to help understand what's the basic information about a photograph, for example, or a piece. And many are collaborating, and I'm optimistic about some of those creating practices across organizations that might help the end user better understand what is a journalistic product, right? But at the end, journalists can flourish in any context. So a YouTube influencer can at some point be critical in a process and can do tremendous work. And I'm thinking about many independent journalists that they only have those platforms to reach the public and engage with them. So again, I think it's about all of us that I think generally want a healthy, safe environment for journalism to learn how to work together, includes tech platforms, and on how to improve the news ecosystem, right? To make it work at the end to the end user, because this is about the right of the public to get the news, right? It's not a privilege for anyone. It's about the right of the public. We're just the conduit in this process, but we need certain rights and environment to be able to do so.
So with that, I'd like for you to give one ask to the Biden-Harris administration. If we could get them on the phone right now to advocate for press freedom, what would be the one ask? Would it be to stop harassing Assange? Would it be to pardon Snowden? What would be the one ask?
Well, for me, it would be more systemic than any single thing. I think appointing a very high-level press freedom envoy who would travel with the Secretary of State or travel with the president and bring that level of priority to this issue would be enormously important. Having a press freedom kind of conference that the administration was actively leading could be a part of that, maybe a way to kick that off. So I really think it's not only making a statement, but then day to day having somebody in there who's well placed, who's advocating for press freedom around the world. So I think that would be my number one ask.
That would be exactly my number one ask. It's not that we have kind of shared a lot of the work and breastfeeding happening in the US, but why? Why? It's not because we believe it. I think we all believe this is a critical point to try to turn things around, basically. And not only for the US, for the global breastfeeding environment, for trying to bring back democracies where we're not thriving anymore, and trying to encourage like a new human rights-based environment for the global community, right? And starting with press freedom, which we believe is a foundational principle, foundational right for all of the others, having this special envoy will make that very explicit. In the same way, I don't know, in other administrations help build like structural changes in how the U.S. addresses and defends human rights around the world. I think this is about approaching press freedom the same way. It's about making not possible anymore for any administration, regardless of where they're coming from or what they think, not to have press freedom as a central principle of the foreign policy. I think we need to be very clear and intentional about building for the future.
Thank you so much. We'll get those asks right to Biden-Harris. We so appreciate your time today, and of course the work of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and CPJ, and you both. Thank you for your time. We hope to have you back in a few months to see if maybe we have that envoy.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.